If you and I happen to share a love of old Land Rovers, one model that I believe you absolutely cannot ignore is the L322 Range Rover, which is what we have here today. I think the Range Rover of this generation had all the styling cues right, it had the driving characteristics correct, and every part of it was just well balanced between being a pure luxury off-road car and an off-road car through and through. I believe the L322 Range Rover is the sweet spot in the entire Range Rover history, which we'll talk about as we move along with a review type tour of the 2012 Range Rover Supercharged Range Rover. But if you've been living under a rock for the past 55 years, you might not know what I'm standing next to at the moment. Well, the Range Rover is the beginning of the luxury 4x4 car, which was a segment that was later embraced by luxury brands such as BMW with the X5 and Mercedes-Benz with the ML class. But that took about 40 years after the original 1970 Range Rover Classic, and the Range Rover was already 2 generations in and due for the replacement of the L322. So let's talk a little bit about the history. The Range Rover started in 1970 as the Range Rover, just the Range Rover, but then it later took on the name the Range Rover Classic as it moved into the 1990s. And then the Range Rover Classic was replaced by the second generation Range Rover, the P38, which was codenamed Pegasus. My dad owns one of those, he's very proud of it, but he's just spent about a year and a half rebuilding the engine, so that's mostly what P38s were known for. Unreliability and being absolutely beautiful, so that's where that started in Range Rover's history, and that continued to the L322, the generation we're standing next to right here. The L322 was known for being hideously unreliable, at least in the early years, most of all with the BMW engines, but also being absolutely gorgeous and extremely luxurious inside. And that's a trend that continued on to the L405 Range Rover, which replaced the L322 for the next model year, 2013. I've done a review of an L405 plug-in hybrid Range Rover. Yes, they did a plug-in hybrid. Imagine what that is like 100,000 miles in. I did a review on one of those, linked on the screen right now. And then the L405 was recently replaced a few years ago with the L460, which looked sort of just like an evolution of the L405, but it was even more luxurious. And in its design and appearance and driving feel, in my opinion, it strayed even further away from being a true off-roader. This L322, I believe, out of all the Range Rovers I've driven, excluding the Classic, something I haven't experienced ever, is the sweet spot when it comes to feeling luxurious, but also still feeling like you could take it absolutely anywhere. You could take a brand new Range Rover anywhere, but judging on the size of the 22-inch wheels that it's offered with, you probably wouldn't want to take it that much further from a Starbucks drive-thru. This Range Rover does have 20-inch wheels, but these tires are so huge that honestly I'm surprised that they're 20-inch wheels because they look quite small on this L322. So speaking of the L322, what you are here watching this video likely on the toilet to experience, the L322 went through a couple different iterations during its lifetime. Beginning in 2003 for the North American market, the L322 replaced the P38 Range Rover, like I mentioned. That had been going since 1994, and it began with BMW engines, most specifically BMW's M62 V8, and it had BMW electronics inside, which were not a good idea in the Range Rover. It was a complete disaster when it comes to reliability, and anybody who knows anything about these Range Rovers will tell you to run away from those early L322s. And by the time the L322 hit the scene in North America, BMW had long given up the Land Rover brand to Ford for their premier automotive group, which is a whole different discussion. But Ford was the owner of Land Rover, but Land Rover was still using BMW engines for the Range Rover because of some complicated contracts, I'm sure. But what you want for ultimate prestige and performance is this later generation, which has Jaguar's famous 5-liter supercharged V8 under the hood, which we'll look at here in just a few minutes. If you want the most powerful, the most prestigious, and the most insane, muscular, strong version of the L322, you want a later 5-liter supercharged V8. If you want the most reliable version of the L322, might I suggest a Toyota Land Cruiser instead, if that's important to you. but if you want the least unreliable version of the L322, you're probably looking at the earlier second iteration of the L322. So with that complicated and badly told storytelling of the Range Rover history and the L322, let's move on and check out practicality around the back, which I'm sure still has a split folding tailgate. One other thing that I have to mention is the fact that the only way you can tell this thing has a screaming 5-liter supercharged V8 is this tiny, subtle little supercharged badge on the back tailgate right there. $10 on eBay and you can have your regular V8 Range Rover have the same badge and nobody would be able to tell the difference. But that's always been a thing with the full-sized Range Rover and its most highest performance models, is that they were always really understated and prioritize things like looking luxurious and expensive rather than looking sporty and ridiculous. That was something that was more for the smaller Range Rover Sport to do. And speaking of the Range Rover Sport, this L322 generation Range Rover was the first full-size Range Rover to be joined by a smaller variant, the Range Rover Sport, and by the end of the L322, the Range Rover Evoque was about to hit the scene. But we're not talking about those small, pathetic, fake Range Rovers based on Land Rover Discoveries on this video today. We're talking about the full-size Range Rover, and one thing that the full-size Range Rover has always had equipped is a split folding tailgate, which is manual in this, which I wouldn't really expect from a 2012 full-size Range Rover. I'd expect part of this to be electronic, but that's not a big deal. What is the most important thing when it comes to a full-size Range Rover is that you get a nice little chair to sit on and relax while you wait for the AA truck to come rescue you on the side of the British motorway. And this upper tailgate piece means that you're blocked from the rain that will inevitably be falling if you're in England. What you have, again, split folding tailgate that is fully manual in its operation, except for the electronic releases to actually release them so you can open it. You look inside and you see, as you would well expect for a full-size Range Rover, it is a big off-roader car and it needs to have plenty of space for your luggage, for your family, for a weekend away, and all the spare parts and tools because, let's face it, to be honest, you might need it. And I know that for certain because, once again, my dad owns a P38 Range Rover, and he and I regularly road trip in it, which is pretty brave on our part. And every time we go anywhere in that car, we pack our luggage in, and then we need to remember to bring his bag of tools. So, and you know, coolant and oil and stuff like that. But this Range Rover shouldn't cause us many problems today. Okay, I've been going off a little bit. Let's go ahead and check out rear seat room. Getting in the back of the L322 Range Rover, I have to mention, as I always do, I am 6'3", I am tall. This driver's seat is in my driving position because why would it not be? So, sit inside here, and it's not particularly big. To be honest, like I said, this driver's seat is pretty much all the way back, and it's digging into my knees quite a bit more than I expected. Oh, that sounds nice. Excuse me. Power reclining backrests on this side, which means that even though my legs are touching the seat in front of me, which is rather unfortunate, I do have the ability to recline myself just a little bit. When you sit in here, it still feels so upright and tall and boxy and rugged, which I think the L405 and L460 Range Rovers largely moved on from, for better or worse. The newer Range Rovers had much nicer interiors and felt like pure upper level professional luxury vehicles. This one still has quite a bit of off-roader to its personality, and you can take with that what you will. Then moving on to materials and amenities and luxury and stuff like that, you do have automatic dual zone climate control back here, which is really nice to see, controlled by these dials. You can also control the airflow, and you have 2 cigarette style charging outlets as well as an aux port back here for some reason, which is nice, I guess. In the center here, you have a massive, huge center console fold down area, which includes the middle headrest, which is interesting, has two basic cup holders, and in the center, a little storage area. Not that much to write home about, except for the fact that it's a large chunk of the middle part of the back seat here that you're folding down just for a couple crappy cup holders. But hey, not that big of a deal. In terms of comfort, like I said, it's not great. I could do with a bit more room, which is probably why for the L405, the next generation, they introduced a long wheelbase version for the first time, because I imagine some high corporate level businessmen were complaining about being stuck back here and they wanted a bit more back seat room. So now that we've extensively explored the rear seat of the L322, let's hop up front and see what it's like for the driver. Okay, if you are the purchaser of this vehicle and you're planning on off-roading it, or more likely taking it to Starbucks every morning for a Frappuccino, then you will be sitting up here in the front seat of the L322. And as you would well expect for a Range Rover, there are a couple things to talk about. Number one, the most important, at least to me and every Range Rover fan, is that you have the classic Range Rover armrest, which is completely redundant, as you can see, because my arm and elbow are resting on the center console lid, which is well capable of keeping my arms comfortable. But Land Rover and the British people are not one to leave tradition behind, as everybody knows. So you still have this glorious tiny little armrest right here with the little screw to screw it in place, tighten it down anywhere you like, as long as it's right here at the very bottom. And you can kind of use it. It's kind of not even in the way. And then you move on to things that are most important for regular people that are buying one of these, which is the fact that you have a hugely tall, commanding driving position up here. You feel like you're on top of the world and that you could run over every car that you drive by. It has a great driving position for a car of this type, where you feel really high up, and that helps with the whole ethos of an off-road luxury SUV. And then you move on to things like materials. You have a lovely leather stitched dashboard right here, and everything you touch feels reasonably okay. There are some materials that aren't the greatest. Like I said, this door panel material is soft touch plastic, but they made an effort to make everything look rugged and luxurious at the same time. You have this lovely navigation screen right here, which I'm sure was cutting edge 15 years ago. Now it's not even worth talking about, except for the fact that on this one, the reverse camera doesn't work, which is rather unfortunate, but you still have navigation and your media, Bluetooth, and all the things that you would want for a luxury SUV in 2012. Moving down from that, you have a bunch of manual controls for things like your climate and for opening the rear hatch back there. And then back from that, you have your drive controls, and a 6-speed automatic transmission controlled with this traditional mechanical lever right here that also incorporates a manual shift function and a low range gearbox, which is controlled back here with Land Rover's first ever terrain response system. This was a computer controlled system that would dial up things like traction control to help you get along on any off-road path that you chose. This was the first iteration of Land Rover's terrain response system, which later added an automatic function, but in this it was just you select which terrain you're on, the car will do the rest, but you have to know what is outside the windows there. You can't go off of what the car thinks. And then behind that, you have the world's biggest electronic parking brake switch, which I think is kind of ridiculous looking, but I guess they had enough space here just not doing anything. So they thought, let's make the parking brake switch take up all of the space there. So that's what they did. Moving on to the digital gauge cluster over there, which has an analog look to it, but the gauges are actually digital and it is an actual screen. And when it comes to configuring, it's very basic, but kind of what you'd expect for the time. Digital gauge clusters were just making a comeback in the early 2010s on luxury vehicles, and the Range Rover was not going to be one to lose out on that trend. So this later iteration of the L322 offers digital gauges, which are just basically analog gauges in their look and their function. So that completely defeats the purpose of digital gauges, in my opinion. But we'll forget about that. And we move on to this oversized steering wheel, which just feels so upper class and so businesslike and so serious. It's just something that you're going to be gripping on your way to your business job to lay off half the company, or something that you're going to be gripping on your way up a steep mountain face. It is just the business when it comes to a Range Rover steering wheel. It is absolutely brilliant, if you ask me. All right, let's talk about the supercharged V8 under the hood. In the year 2012, you could get a 5-liter naturally aspirated V8 in the L322 Range Rover, which had 370 horsepower and developed 376 pound-feet of torque. But what you wanted was supercharger whine and 503 horsepower supplemented by 461 pound-feet of torque, which is what the supercharged Range Rover offered for the last iteration of this generation of Range Rover. So with that, I want to turn your attention to the notable size of the hood latch on the inside of the car, because they made it large for maybe, I don't know, people might be using it a little bit more often than in other cars. Sorry. Let's move on from that. And I think it's time to listen to some supercharger whine and some V8 growls, take this out on the road, and hope that it doesn't break down. Driving the supercharged Range Rover, the first version of the supercharged Range Rover under the L322 generation, which I've said probably 150,000 times in this video, but that's the code name for this chassis of the third generation Range Rover. And I have to say, I have extensive experience in the generation of Range Rover before this, which is the P38. I haven't done a proper video on that car yet, but at some point I'm planning on it. They took everything that the P38 lacked in terms of prestige and driving feel and solved it for this one. It still has that Range Rover feel with that hugely commanding driving position where you feel so high up and it's just like you're on top of the world and everybody around you works for you. They're all your servants, your employees, your interns. You own this entire area. That's the feeling that this car gives you. And it drives quite competently on the road. One thing that I'm not a big fan of on the P38, the steering is a bit too hard and the brakes feel just awful, disgusting. And this L322 solves that problem. The brakes feel just fine, and the steering is nice and light to the point where you could just steer it with 2 fingers if you needed to, which is what you want from a luxury car. But it also has the feeling of ruggedness, of the capability for you to do off-roading whenever it takes your fancy. I think the L322, like I've said, offers the best combination of feeling like a purely rugged off-road vehicle as well as a really nice, expensive luxury car at the same time. And for this generation, again, the supercharged V8 with 503 horsepower came into the equation. Let's see what that feels like. It's just crazy because this feels, when I'm sitting in this driving position, it feels like an old Range Rover in all the right ways. It's got this really upright, tall, boxy cabin, and it feels like a sort of old school off-roader, at least in the position that you sit in as you're driving it. And then you put your foot down and you're met with this glorious V8 bellow. You realize it's not the most powerful thing in the world, but given what you were led to expect as you first got in this car, you're very surprised by the ability to get speeding tickets that this car offers. It's very, very quick. It's got a lot of torque and a lot of power. You put your foot down and it just flies. Also, when you're going over bumps and things like that, it's a lot more comfortable than the P38 because this was the first Range Rover to feature a fully monocoque construction, meaning the body and chassis were built as one, and independent suspension, which means, yes, it might not be as good as towing and other, in my opinion, meaningless things, but you get a nicer, more comfortable, more supple ride. As you go over uneven terrain, you're not knocked back and forth to the point where you're getting a concussion by hitting the window. It's just comfortable and it's easily daily drivable, at least as long as you have a mechanic on speed dial, because again, it is a Range Rover, and Range Rover reliability at best has always been so, yeah. But if you have the pleasure and the privilege of getting to daily drive one of these L322s, it's very quiet, it's very comfortable, it's got a very nice air conditioning system, which I'm grateful for at the moment. Once again, that's another big improvement over the P38, is better air conditioning. When it comes to just driving this thing on roads, it is a much more enjoyable experience. And when it comes to off-road, thanks to this terrain response system and other technologies such as hill descent control and a low-range gearbox, you can be quite confident in the knowledge that this thing is going to get you anywhere you need to go, as long as you've replaced all of the things that are going to break and have extra parts and tools in the trunk. You can probably get pretty much anywhere in one of these. Sure, newer Range Rovers are more pleasant to drive on the road. Newer Range Rovers are quieter and feel more isolated and have nicer materials in and out, and they do make you feel rather special as you drive them. But I think this L322, I'll say it again for the final time, I think this L322 offers the right combination of feeling luxurious and expensive and comfortable and nice to drive on roads, but also feeling like an old school rugged off-roader. And that's a hard thing to get these days. With that, I'm gonna end that video there. I hope everybody enjoyed. Like, subscribe, do all the normal YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.